The rain had begun before midnight, falling softly across the rooftops of Manhattan and running in thin lines along the darkened streets. Wartime blackout curtains covered the windows of apartment buildings, and most radios in the city had already gone silent for the night. But inside a narrow room above a small communications office in Lower New York, one receiver was still humming with quiet electricity. The dim desk lamp cast a weak circle of light over a metal radio set, in its dials glowing faintly in the darkness. The man sitting there was not a soldier. He wore no uniform and carried no weapon. His job was routine, monitoring shortwave signals that moved invisibly across the Atlantic. On most nights, the frequencies carried ordinary things: merchant ship traffic, weather reports, or scattered amateur transmissions fading in and out of static. Yet sometimes the signals felt different, brief, mechanical, as if someone was speaking carefully through layers of noise. In the early hours of one June morning in 1942, the operator heard such a signal again. It appeared suddenly in the headphones, sharp bursts of tone breaking through the background hiss of the receiver. The sound was unmistakable to anyone trained in Morse, but it was not the steady rhythm of a commercial station. The pattern was deliberate, tightly spaced, and almost hurried. The operator leaned closer to the desk, pencil moving across a scrap of paper as the signal repeated. And the message did not contain words in plain language. Instead, it arrived as a sequence of coded groups, numbers and letters without meaning to anyone who did not possess the proper key. Yet something about its timing felt wrong. The transmission lasted less than 2 minutes, then vanished abruptly back into static. Outside, the rain continued falling across the city. Streetlights reflected in wet pavement, while distant police sirens echoed faintly along the avenues. New York still believed the war was happening far away, across oceans and battlefields most Americans would never see. But the signal suggested something unsettling. Someone, somewhere in the United States, had just sent a coded radio message toward Germany. The operator stared at the receiver for several seconds after the signal faded. The frequency was quiet again. No explanation followed. Only silence filled the headphones. He slowly circled the time of the transmission in his notebook, and then he reached for the telephone. What he had heard was small, just a few seconds of sound hidden in the static of the Atlantic airwaves. But within weeks, that brief signal would help unravel one of the largest Nazi espionage networks ever discovered inside the United States, and it would lead the Federal Bureau of Investigation directly to 33 German agents operating on American soil. The telephone line remained quiet for several seconds after the radio operator finished describing what he had heard. On the other end, the duty officer listened carefully, writing short notes as the details were repeated. The report sounded simple at first, a coded transmission detected on a shortwave receiver. But during wartime, such things were never treated lightly. Radio signals could travel across oceans and sometimes across borders that armies had not yet reached. The operator explained the signal again. It had appeared suddenly on a frequency not normally used for commercial traffic. The Morse code groups were structured in blocks, 5 characters at a time, sent quickly and without hesitation. To an experienced listener, that pattern suggested preparation. Someone had written the message beforehand and transmitted it as efficiently as possible, minimizing the chance of detection. In wartime intelligence, speed often meant secrecy, or the faster a transmission ended, the less likely enemy monitoring stations would be able to trace its origin. Direction-finding equipment required time, sometimes several minutes, to triangulate a signal. A message lasting less than 2 minutes could vanish before technicians completed their calculations. Whoever had sent the transmission seemed to understand that principle well. The operator also mentioned something else that had caught his attention. The signal strength had been unusually clear, and not faint and distant like transmissions from Europe, but sharp and immediate, suggesting the source might be somewhere within North America. The idea lingered quietly in the air between the two men on the telephone line. If that assumption was correct, the meaning became troubling. The United States had entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The nation's factories were producing aircraft, tanks, and ammunition at unprecedented speed, and shipyards along the eastern seaboard launched cargo vessels destined for Britain and the Soviet Union. Protecting those supply routes was essential to the Allied war effort. German intelligence understood this reality very well. The German intelligence service, the Abwehr, had spent years training agents in sabotage and clandestine communication before the war began. Many of these operatives were taught to use portable radio transmitters capable of sending encrypted Morse code messages directly to Europe. Such radios could be hidden in basements, warehouses, or ordinary apartments, transmitting information about factories, shipping schedules, or military movements. The question slowly forming inside the FBI office that night was not whether German spies existed. Intelligence officers already knew they did. And the real uncertainty was something far more dangerous. Where exactly were they operating? If the radio signal truly originated somewhere in the United States, then an enemy transmitter had just broadcast sensitive information directly from American soil, and radio signals, once sent, could not be taken back. The duty officer thanked the operator and carefully wrote down the exact frequency and time of the transmission, and the information would be forwarded to investigators who specialized in radio monitoring and counter-espionage. But as the report moved quietly through the early hours of the morning, another question began to emerge. How many such transmissions had already been sent, unnoticed among the thousands of ordinary signals crossing the Atlantic every day? Somewhere in New York, a radio operator had heard only one. But what if that message was not the first? And what if the person sending it had already been working in silence for months? The mystery was no longer theoretical. It had a signal, a frequency, and a precise moment in time. Now, investigators needed to discover who had pressed the transmitter key. Lower Manhattan in 1942 was a city of restless movement. Freight trucks rolled through narrow streets near the harbor, carrying crates stamped with military markings. A tugboat sounded their horns along the Hudson River, while longshoremen worked under dim floodlights, loading cargo bound for the Atlantic convoys. Even at night, the city rarely slept. The war had turned New York into one of the busiest logistical centers in the Allied world. Inside a modest communications office several blocks from the waterfront, a civilian technician named Alfred H. Langley continued his quiet work among rows of radio receivers. Now, Langley was not famous and held no government rank. His position was technical, monitoring shortwave traffic and maintaining radio equipment used by shipping companies and commercial stations. Yet, like many Americans during the war, his skills had become unexpectedly valuable. Langley had learned radio years earlier as a young amateur operator fascinated by distant signals carried through the air. He understood the small habits of Morse code operators, the rhythm of their keys, the spacing between letters, even the tiny imperfections that revealed human hands behind the machine. To him, radio was not simply sound, it was behavior. During wartime, that sensitivity could mean the difference between ordinary communication and something hidden. The office where Langley worked smelled faintly of warm metal and electrical insulation. Vacuum tubes inside the receivers glowed dim orange, and the steady hum of transformers filled the room like a quiet mechanical heartbeat. Outside, rain tapped against the window, while the city's blackout regulations kept most lights dark after midnight. The signal he had reported earlier that night continued to trouble him. Langley replayed the pattern in his memory while reviewing the notes he had scribbled on a scrap of paper. 5 character groups, Rapid transmission. No hesitation between sequences. Whoever had sent the message was experienced. Amateur radio hobbyists rarely transmitted in such disciplined bursts. And the message had also appeared on a frequency used occasionally by overseas stations, but rarely by local operators. That detail alone made the signal unusual enough to remember. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence had long relied on radio communication to coordinate espionage networks. The German military intelligence service, known as the Abwehr, frequently used shortwave transmitters to communicate with agents operating abroad. These devices were small enough to be hidden in suitcases or concealed inside furniture, allowing spies to send coded reports directly to Europe. Langley knew this only in general terms. Like many radio technicians during the war, he had read newspaper reports about espionage trials and sabotage plots, but he did not imagine himself involved in anything resembling those stories. His role remained technical and quiet. Still, something about the signal felt deliberate. He adjusted the tuning dial on the receiver again, scanning slowly across nearby frequencies. Static crackled through the headphones, occasionally interrupted by faint voices or distant Morse transmissions. Most of it belonged to merchant ships and weather stations scattered across the Atlantic. Nothing unusual returned. For several minutes, as the equipment remained silent except for background noise, Langley leaned back in his chair and listened carefully. In radio monitoring, impatience often revealed patterns that quick observation missed. Operators sometimes waited hours for signals to reappear, but as the night stretched toward dawn, the mysterious transmission did not repeat. The frequency remained empty. Somewhere beyond the rain-soaked streets of New York, a transmitter had briefly come alive, sent a coded message, and then disappeared again into silence. And Langley had been one of the few people in the country who heard it happen. At that moment, and he did not yet realize that his small observation would soon connect him to a much larger investigation, one that federal agents had already begun quietly across the United States, an investigation that would eventually expose 33 German espionage agents operating inside America during World War II. The report from the radio operator did not remain on a desk for long. Within hours, the frequency and transmission details had been passed quietly through internal channels of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where a small division handled matters related to wartime espionage. Since the United States had entered the war, investigators in that office had grown accustomed to unusual reports, strange phone calls, coded letters, and occasional sightings of suspicious transmitters. Most of those reports turned out to be harmless misunderstandings. Amateur hobbyists sometimes experimented with unusual frequencies. Maritime operators occasionally transmitted incomplete messages during storms, but the signal described by the New York technician did not quite match those ordinary explanations. The pattern of 5 character groups was especially troubling. During the war, intelligence agencies on both sides relied heavily on encrypted radio traffic. Messages were often broken into groups of letters or numbers that meant nothing by themselves. Only someone with the proper cipher key could reconstruct the real meaning. The system allowed spies to send detailed reports without revealing their content if the signal was intercepted. For investigators studying the technician's notes, the structure looked familiar. German intelligence networks commonly used 5-letter code groups in their encrypted radio communications during World War II. And this format simplified the encoding process and allowed messages to be transmitted quickly through Morse code. That detail alone did not prove the signal originated from a spy, but it raised a question investigators could not ignore. If the transmission had been sent from somewhere inside the United States, then someone within the country was communicating secretly with Germany. The FBI already understood that such a possibility existed. The FBI's Special Intelligence Service and counter-espionage divisions were actively monitoring suspected German agents inside the United States during the early years of World War II. Many of these investigations focused on individuals who had entered the country before the war and maintained quiet contact with German intelligence organizations. New York, with its large ports and immigrant communities, had long been considered a potential center for clandestine activity, and ships arrived daily from dozens of countries. Warehouses stored military supplies destined for Allied forces overseas. Information about cargo routes and ship departures could be extremely valuable to enemy submarines operating in the Atlantic. German U-boats were already hunting Allied shipping lanes. During 1942, German submarines launched a campaign along the American East Coast known as the Second Happy Time, sinking hundreds of Allied merchant ships. Any intelligence about convoy schedules or cargo shipments could make those attacks even more effective. That possibility made the radio transmission far more serious. Investigators began by reviewing recent reports of suspicious radio activity across the northeastern United States. Monitoring stations occasionally recorded brief signals whose origins were never fully determined. At the time, most of those incidents were filed away as unresolved technical anomalies. Now, the agents returned to those records. Patterns slowly began to emerge. Some of the earlier transmissions shared the same characteristics described by the New York operator, short bursts of Morse code lasting less than 2 minutes. Several had appeared late at night. Others were detected only once before disappearing completely. None had been traced to a confirmed location. For radio intelligence officers, that detail suggested careful planning. Skilled operators often transmitted quickly, then dismantled their equipment or changed locations to avoid detection. Portable transmitters used by espionage agents were designed precisely for that purpose. The question facing investigators was no longer whether the signal might be suspicious. The question was whether it belonged to a larger network already operating quietly across the country. If that possibility proved true, the consequences could reach far beyond a single coded message. Somewhere within the crowded streets of New York, or perhaps another city entirely, someone possessed a transmitter capable of sending secret reports across the Atlantic, and whoever controlled that transmitter had already proven they knew how to remain hidden. The investigation began quietly, as most counter-espionage work did during the war. No public announcement was made, and no immediate arrests followed. Instead, the agents inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation began assembling fragments of information that had accumulated slowly during the previous months. Each report by itself had seemed small: an unusual radio signal, a suspicious meeting, a coded letter intercepted by postal inspectors. But when examined together, those fragments began to form a pattern. The radio transmission reported by Alfred Langley became one of the first technical clues. A specialist within the Bureau's communications section analyzed the frequency with which he had written in his notebook. Monitoring stations across the eastern United States were asked to listen for similar signals. Technicians adjusted their receivers late at night, waiting for the brief bursts of Morse code that might appear again. Radio detection in the early 1940s required patience. Unlike modern electronic surveillance, investigators could not simply track a signal instantly across large distances. Instead, operators listened carefully while direction-finding equipment attempted to estimate the origin of each transmission. Direction-finding technology had been used by military and intelligence agencies since the First World War to locate radio transmitters by triangulating signal bearings from multiple listening stations. If 2 or 3 monitoring posts captured the same signal at the same time, then technicians could compare the angles of reception and estimate where the transmission originated. But the method had limitations. A signal lasting only a minute or two might disappear before enough stations could record it. This appeared to be exactly how the unknown operator was working. While radio technicians waited for another transmission, FBI investigators examined other leads that had quietly accumulated across the country. Reports from field offices mentioned individuals suspected of maintaining pro-German sympathies, particularly those who had traveled frequently between the United States and Europe before the war began. Some of those individuals were already under discreet observation. Agents watched apartment buildings, followed suspects through city streets, and quietly reviewed financial records and telephone contacts. Surveillance teams worked carefully, avoiding any action that might alert the people they were observing. In espionage investigations, premature arrests could sometimes destroy the chance to uncover a larger network. Meanwhile, the mysterious radio signal continued to shape the direction of the investigation. Langley himself was asked to provide additional details about what he had heard. Investigators visited the communications office where he worked, examining the receiver and confirming the exact frequency range used that night. They treated him not as a suspect, but as a witness, someone whose technical observation might help guide their search. The technician described the sound of the signal again, sharp Morse tones, transmitted quickly, followed by complete silence. He also remembered something else. The operator sending the message had a distinctive rhythm, fast but slightly uneven between certain letters. Experienced Morse operators often developed subtle habits when using a telegraph key. Those habits sometimes acted like fingerprints, allowing listeners to recognize the same operator again later. Langley had noticed a similar rhythm once before, months earlier, while scanning late-night frequencies. At the time, he had dismissed it as a coincidence. Now the memory became important. Investigators began reviewing earlier radio monitoring logs across several cities. Gradually, they located 2 additional recordings that resembled the signal Langley described. Both had been detected briefly during the previous winter. Both transmissions had vanished before technicians could locate their origin, but one small detail connected them. Each signal had been received strongest along the eastern seaboard. If the pattern was correct, then the unknown transmitter was likely operating somewhere within a heavily populated coastal region, perhaps New York, perhaps another nearby city. The investigation was still far from solving the mystery, and yet with each clue collected, the possibility of a hidden espionage network inside the United States became more difficult to dismiss, and somewhere out there, the radio operator who had sent the message might already be preparing to transmit again. As the investigation widened, the atmosphere inside the Bureau's counter-espionage division began to shift from curiosity to concern. Reports arriving from various field offices suggested that the mysterious radio signal might not be an isolated event. Instead, it might represent a communication link within a much broader intelligence network operating quietly across the United States. Agents working in New York began increasing surveillance on several individuals who had previously appeared in intelligence files. Most of these men lived ordinary lives on the surface. Factory technicians, shipping clerks, mechanics, or small business owners. Their daily routines showed nothing openly suspicious. They commuted to work, bought groceries, and returned home like thousands of other civilians living under wartime rationing and blackout restrictions. Yet intelligence investigations often relied on subtle inconsistencies. A man who traveled frequently without a clear explanation. Someone who received coded letters from overseas, an individual who seemed unusually interested in harbor activity or ship departures. Each of these details could appear harmless by itself, but when combined with unexplained radio transmissions, the patterns became difficult to ignore. The eastern seaboard had already become a battlefield of a different kind. During 1942, German U-boats conducted extensive attacks against shipping along the American East Coast, sinking hundreds of vessels in what German commanders called Operation Drumbeat. Merchant ships leaving ports such as New York, Norfolk, and Boston were essential to supplying Allied forces overseas. Information about convoy schedules, cargo loads, or defensive escorts could dramatically increase the success of submarine attacks. This possibility weighed heavily on investigators. If a spy network inside the United States was transmitting such information to Germany, the consequences could be severe. Even small fragments of intelligence, departure times, cargo descriptions, or ship routes might allow U-boats to position themselves along vulnerable sections of the Atlantic. The coded transmission heard by Alfred Langley suddenly carried much greater significance. Inside FBI offices, agents began studying shipping schedules and harbor activity during the time of the mysterious signal. They compared those records with recent U-boat attacks reported along Atlantic shipping lanes. The process was slow and methodical, by requiring investigators to examine hundreds of documents and shipping manifests. Nothing conclusive appeared at first, but the investigation continued to gather quiet momentum. Surveillance teams watched suspects entering and leaving apartment buildings late at night. Postal inspectors examined international mail for unusual code patterns. Telephone operators occasionally provided records of calls placed to foreign consulates or suspicious contacts. Meanwhile, our radio monitoring stations maintained a constant watch for another transmission. The equipment used by espionage agents was often portable, small transmitters powered by household electricity or concealed batteries. Skilled operators rarely used them for long periods, knowing that radio signals could eventually reveal their location. For this reason, many intelligence networks relied on extremely short broadcasts. Sometimes the messages lasted only 60 or 90 seconds before the transmitter went silent again. Weeks passed with no new signal detected. Winter slowly gave way to the warmer air of spring. Fog rolled in from the Atlantic during certain nights, covering harbor districts in thick gray mist. In quiet neighborhoods across New York and nearby cities, ordinary families listened to evening news reports describing distant battles in Europe and North Africa. Most civilians believed the war was still far away, but inside several FBI offices, investigators knew that the conflict had already reached American soil in a quieter, more secretive form. Somewhere within the crowded streets of the East Coast, a transmitter still existed, and whoever controlled it had not yet made a mistake. But in espionage work, mistakes were rarely avoided forever. Eventually, even the most careful operator had to press the key again. The breakthrough did not arrive through a dramatic raid or sudden confession. Instead, it emerged slowly through accumulated evidence, small details gathered from radio monitoring logs, surveillance reports, and intercepted communications. By mid-1944, investigators inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation had begun to understand that the suspicious radio signals might be connected to a far larger espionage network than they had first imagined. The earlier transmission reported by Alfred Langley had become one piece of a complex intelligence puzzle. Across several cities in the United States, FBI agents had already been tracking individuals suspected of maintaining secret contact with German intelligence. Some of these suspects had lived in America for many years, blending easily into ordinary civilian life. Others had arrived more recently, in sometimes posing as businessmen or technicians while quietly gathering information useful to Germany. Evidence against them accumulated gradually. Agents observed meetings in quiet cafes, unusual financial transfers, and coded letters hidden within otherwise harmless correspondence. Each detail by itself revealed little. But when investigators placed the pieces together, a pattern of organized espionage began to appear. The turning point came through a combination of surveillance and intercepted communications. One suspect under observation in New York began behaving cautiously but noticeably differently. He changed his daily routes through the city, visited unfamiliar buildings late at night, and occasionally carried small packages that appeared to contain electronic components. Investigators suspected these items might be connected to radio equipment. Now, such equipment would have been essential for transmitting intelligence across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, radio monitoring stations finally detected another short transmission, resembling the earlier signal Langley had described. The Morse pattern was similar, rapid 5-character groups sent in quick succession before disappearing back into static. This time, however, technicians managed to record partial direction bearings. The estimated signal origin pointed toward the northeastern United States, and the information was enough for the Bureau to intensify surveillance. Agents followed several suspects more closely, quietly documenting their movements and contacts. Apartments were observed, vehicles were tracked, trash collected from certain buildings was examined for scraps of coded notes or technical materials. The investigation required patience, often stretching over many months. Eventually, the pattern of communication became clear. During World War II, German intelligence operated espionage networks within the United States that attempted to gather industrial, military, and shipping information for transmission back to Germany. These networks relied heavily on covert radio transmitters and encrypted messages. By the time investigators completed their analysis, they had identified a network far larger than originally expected. In 1944, the FBI uncovered a major German espionage network operating in the United States and arrested 33 suspected agents. The arrests occurred carefully and almost simultaneously to prevent suspects from warning each other or destroying evidence. Federal agents moved quietly through several cities, entering apartments and offices where radio equipment, coded documents, and intelligence reports were discovered. Some of the captured individuals possessed portable transmitters capable of sending Morse code messages directly across the Atlantic. Others maintained contact with handlers overseas or helped collect industrial information from American factories and shipping facilities. The investigation had confirmed what the mysterious radio signal first suggested months earlier. German intelligence had indeed been operating inside the United States, and a brief transmission overheard by a civilian radio operator in New York had helped lead investigators toward one of the largest espionage crackdowns of the war. The arrests did not become public immediately. For several weeks after federal agents moved against the suspected operatives, much of the investigation remained classified. The wartime authorities understood that revealing too many details about the case could alert other intelligence networks or reveal how American counter-espionage units had discovered them. Inside FBI offices, however, the scale of the operation was already clear. Documents seized from apartments and storage rooms began to reveal the structure of the network. Investigators recovered coded notebooks, radio components, cipher pads, and handwritten reports describing industrial production and shipping movements along the eastern seaboard. Some papers were hidden carefully behind false panels or inside ordinary household objects. The discovery confirmed what investigators had suspected for months. German intelligence agencies had attempted to gather information about American war production, shipping routes, and military facilities during World War II. Such intelligence could assist submarine commanders, inform bombing strategies, or help German planners understand the growing strength of Allied industry. Many of the arrested individuals had lived quietly in the United States for years before the war. Some worked in manufacturing plants or transportation companies where they could observe industrial activity without drawing attention. Others functioned as couriers, relaying information between different members of the network. In espionage work, such roles were rarely dramatic. Most agents collected small pieces of information, factory output figures, ship departure dates, or descriptions of harbor defenses. When combined and transmitted overseas, those fragments could form a valuable picture of American military logistics. The radio transmitters discovered during the investigation demonstrated how those reports traveled across the Atlantic. Portable shortwave transmitters recovered by the FBI were capable of sending encrypted Morse code messages thousands of miles through the ionosphere. Operators used carefully prepared code books that converted words and numbers into groups of letters. Once encoded, the messages could be transmitted rapidly in bursts lasting only a few minutes. Those short transmissions were precisely the type Alfred Langley had heard months earlier. While the investigation continued, the legal process moved forward as well. Suspects were interrogated and charged under wartime espionage statutes. Evidence collected from radio equipment, coded documents, and surveillance records formed the basis of the government's case. At the time, espionage prosecutions were handled with extraordinary seriousness. During World War II, the United States government strengthened counter-espionage efforts under the leadership of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, greatly expanding investigations of foreign intelligence activity inside the country. The arrests of the 33 suspected agents became part of that broader effort. The case demonstrated that even within a country separated from Europe by thousands of miles of ocean, enemy intelligence networks could still operate quietly if left undetected. For American authorities, the discovery carried two important lessons. First, espionage rarely appeared dramatic, and the individuals involved often lived ordinary lives, hiding their activities behind routine jobs and daily habits. Second, small observations could sometimes expose large secrets. A brief radio transmission lasting less than 2 minutes had helped confirm the existence of a network that investigators might otherwise have struggled to locate. In wartime intelligence, such moments mattered, because a single signal, heard by the right person at the right time, could reveal an entire hidden operation. When, and in this case, the signal had traveled through nothing more than static and airwaves before reaching the headphones of a civilian radio operator in New York. When news of the espionage arrests finally became public, it surprised many Americans who believed the war's intelligence battles were confined to distant fronts in Europe and the Pacific. And newspapers reported that federal investigators had uncovered a network of German agents working quietly inside the country, individuals who had attempted to gather information about industry, shipping, and military activity. For most readers, the discovery felt unsettling. The United States was separated from the main battlefields by vast oceans, yet the war had still managed to reach its cities through secrecy rather than armies. The case reminded civilians that espionage rarely required dramatic acts of sabotage. Sometimes it depended simply on observation, coded messages, and patience. The investigation also highlighted the growing importance of radio monitoring in modern intelligence work. During the early 20th century, wireless communication had transformed global communication. Ships, aircraft, and intelligence services relied heavily on radio signals that traveled across continents and oceans. But the same technology that allowed rapid communication also created opportunities for hidden transmissions. During World War II, both Allied and Axis intelligence agencies relied extensively on encrypted radio communication to coordinate espionage operations. For counterintelligence officers, this meant that radio signals themselves could become valuable clues, even when investigators could not immediately decode a message. And the simple presence of an unauthorized transmission might reveal the existence of a hidden operator. In the case of the New York radio operator, the signal had been short and easily overlooked. Many technicians might have ignored it as background noise or routine interference, but Alfred Langley's experience with Morse code allowed him to recognize the unusual structure of the transmission. And his decision to report the signal created the first documented clue that investigators later connected to a larger network. His role remained largely unknown to the public. Unlike soldiers or military commanders, civilian technicians rarely appeared in wartime headlines, yet their technical knowledge often played a quiet role in protecting military operations. Radio operators, cryptographers, and communication engineers formed an invisible line of defense against espionage, and the arrests of the 33 suspected agents did not end all German intelligence efforts in the United States. Espionage networks were resilient, and intelligence agencies on both sides of the war continued searching for new methods of gathering information. But the investigation significantly disrupted one network and demonstrated that American counter-espionage systems could detect hidden threats. Throughout World War II, the FBI conducted thousands of counter-espionage investigations aimed at preventing sabotage and intelligence gathering by Axis agents inside the United States. By the end of the war in 1945, the conflict had reshaped intelligence work permanently. Radio monitoring, code breaking, and surveillance had become essential tools in modern warfare. The quiet struggle between spies and investigators would continue long after the fighting stopped. For Alfred Langley, life eventually returned to routine, and the receivers on his desk continued humming late at night as ships crossed the Atlantic and distant stations transmitted weather reports through the static. Most signals carried ordinary information again: cargo schedules, navigation updates, fragments of conversation fading in and out of the airwaves. But every so often, a brief transmission would appear unexpectedly, a pattern of Morse tones moving quickly through the noise, and whenever that happened, the operator listened carefully, because once before, a signal lasting less than 2 minutes had helped reveal a hidden war taking place far from the battlefield. A war fought quietly through wires, code books, and the invisible paths of radio waves.